Hey, so today we're going to be cooking some spare ribs on my offset smoker using cherrywood for flavour. We're going to use the 3-2-1 method, and for those of you not familiar with the 3-2-1 method, it's essentially 3 hours in the smoke, 2 hours wrapped, and then an hour unwrapped, sauced if you like. So let's get into it.
So let's look at our timeline for this cook. I'm using the low&slow barbecue app to plan out my times and set my reminders as, well, I created the app specifically for these types of cooks. So in our timeline, our starting step is to apply our first layer of flavour to our ribs by applying a dry rub. Next up, we're going to fire up here. We're going to get it up to ideal smoking temperature before we look to add our ribs to the smoker. Once we've added our ribs to the smoker, we're going to let the smoke do its job before we wrap the ribs. After cooking the ribs wrapped for a couple of hours, we're going to unwrap them and then finally sauce them before leaving them to rest and serving. Okay, let's get into our first step then, our rub. You're going to need some kitchen roll, blunt knife like a butter knife, your choice of dry rub, a beer, well the beer's optional but always a good idea, a sharp knife, and finally your ribs. So let's get started and trim these bad boys up. Now I've got these set of ribs from a local butcher's. I'm trying to do my bit for the local economy with everything that's going on in the pandemic, but they're a little bit thin, not that much meat on, but fairly well trimmed, so not a huge amount to cut off on these, but just going to give them a little trim to tidy them up. Not going to cut these in St. Louis style, just going to leave them kind of as they are. So we're just removing any of the kind of like small little bits that look like they might kind of flap around or get in the way essentially of the rub acting on the meat. So next up, we're going to remove the membrane from the rib. Now the membrane is basically a thin layer of skin that's on the back side of the ribs. The best method I've found of doing this is to get like a blunt knife and kind of push it up underneath the skin, between the bone and the skin, and gradually remove it up. Now, more often than not with this, I'll make a mess of this. But it seems to be going okay at the moment. So just gradually kind of pushing the knife in, leveraging that up. Got a bit of kind of a flap there that I can kind of get my hand underneath. I'm going to just try another bone and just kind of push this up here to create a bit more space. The more of this you can kind of do, the easier this bit of skin will pull off. And this is where our kind of paper towel comes in use, because this sucker's a bit slippery. So gradually levering it up a little bit, making a bit of a meal out of this, and I'll split the skin now. So, but grabbing my paper towel now, I'm just going to try and pull this off. Often you find as well, if these ribs have been kind of trimmed with a machine beforehand, you'll have a mark in there which will prevent this all from coming off in one hit. But ideally, this would all come off in one bit. So we've got one little bit left on there, so we'll just kind of get our knife, try and prise that off. Get a bit of a gap in there. And then pull this sucker off. And some people choose to leave this on. I prefer not to. I think that that lets the smoke kind of penetrate the meat a little bit better, and also your dry rub kind of penetrates the meat a little bit better as well. Sometimes when this is left on, it's kind of like a little bit, it makes the rib a little bit more tougher. Cool, so now our ribs are all trimmed up nicely, we can start applying our dry rub. Now some people like to use like ballpark mustard, like yellow mustard, as kind of a base so that the rub begins to stick easier on these. Other people use olive oil. I'm not bothering with any of that today. I've got enough time that I can kind of let this settle. Just give it a little bit of a pat in to kind of make sure that it's sticking a little bit. This rub's a little bit lumpy in places actually, but this should kind of begin to kind of settle nicely and stick to the ribs if I'm leaving it while my smoker's warming up. Some people actually like to do this the day before and leave these in the fridge overnight, like either wrapping them up in cling film or saran wrap. and kind of let the rub penetrate overnight. But when I've tried that before, I've just found that the rub's been too overpowering. Even when I've used it sparingly. So I prefer to do it the day that I'm cooking them, especially if I've got time while I'm waiting for the smoker to come up to temp. This is generally enough for me to kind of impart enough flavour onto the ribs. So we'll just finish this side off now, just get the edges, try and give it all kind of a nice even covering, give it a little bit of a pat down. I don't tend to actually rub this in, I try to kind of pat it down and just try and give it a bit of an even coverage before we flip it and do the other side. Okay, let's flip these beauties and give the other side a nice even dusting as well. You can see quite clearly across that line where you would normally cut these St. Louis style, but we'll keep that bit on for now. We're just doing these pretty basic. So we'll go ahead and just give this side a covering as well. It's the first time I've used this rub actually, so I'm keen to see how it comes out. It's a little bit kind of cakey and lumpy in places, but fingers crossed it'll taste all right. And one technique I found quite useful for kind of getting to the edges without kind of picking up and then dropping all the rub on the floor or whatever, is to kind of use the side of my hand and just angle it slightly and put the rub actually directed onto my hand. It kind of bounces off onto the sides. But we're pretty much done now, so we'll go ahead and start the next step. Our next step's to light the barbecue. So I'm going to use some lump wood, some wood wool, and a charcoal starter full of lump wood as well. If you've not got a chimney starter, I highly recommend getting one. They're such an invaluable tool for starting fires. And I'm going to do a whole separate video on one of these, I think, because they're just such a useful tool. So with our chimney starter ready, I'm going to tip these out on the unlit coals, let that get settled in a bit, and then add some splits of cherrywood. Obviously, with this being an offset, these cater more for kind of cooking with bigger bits of wood. If you're using a kettle barbecue or a water smoker or something like that, then you're going to be better off with some smaller chunks of wood. So either using chunks or chips, whatever suits for your cooker. But essentially, cherrywood, applewood, oak, beech are all great woods for smoking ribs. As you've probably seen for the background, we've had a bit of snow today, so it's not ideal barbecue weather, but we've given ourselves around 40 minutes to light the chimney and get up to cooking temperature. And we've got nice, cool blue smoke coming out of our chimney now, so we're ready to go. So with our barbecue up to temperature, we just need to add the ribs. So we're going to add these with the bone side down, so frowny side down. And then these are ready for the first kind of real step of the 3-2-1 method, which is the 3 hours in the smoke. So we'll close this up and let the smoke do its job, but we'll check back in on these periodically. The ribs been in the smoke now for about an hour and a half, so we're going to have a quick check on them and give them a bit of a spritz with a mixture of apple cider vinegar and apple juice. I tend to use about 70% apple juice and 30% apple cider vinegar. And there's a couple of advantages to doing this. One, it helps with any of the parts of the meat that look like they might be starting to dry out. And two, the sugars in the liquid help with the caramelization. Now, as the old saying goes, if you're looking, it ain't cooking. And the reason for that is just, obviously, if you're opening up your cooker, the heat's escaping and it's going to take a while to build back up. So I'd recommend doing this every half hour after the first hour, just to try and minimise any negative impacts on your cook. And just like that, through the magic of time travel, well, editing, it's 3:30. So it's time for our next step, which is to wrap those ribs. So as you can see, the ribs have got a nice bit of colour on there and the bark's starting to form nicely. So we're going to pull these off the smoker now and we're going to wrap them. So normally I'd do this step outside near the barbecue, but as you can see, it's snowing and it's below freezing out here. So I'm going to do it somewhere where it's a bit warmer. So for this wrap stage, you're going to need a few important things here. You're going to need some foil or some butcher's paper for the actual wrapping, some butter for some fat content, some sugar to add a little bit of sweetness and also to help with the caramelization later, and then you're going to need some liquid. So I've used apple juice and beer. I've also used a little bit of sweet chili sauce in this. So let's get this wrapped up. So we're going to be flipping the ribs so they're upside down. So the bones are going to be facing up. So the first thing we're going to cover is the side that's going to be down. So the first thing we're going to be doing is adding our sugar. Generally, I kind of like to just place my butter roughly where it's going to be sitting, because we'll be flipping the ribs to on top of the butter. So we'll start adding the sugar now, just kind of liberally on top. Not too much of a heavy layer, just enough to give it a little bit of a light coating. Next up, I like to give it a light splattering of sweet chili sauce, just a tiny bit, not enough to actually really impart too much on the flavour, but it just adds a little bit to that sweetness and caramelisation later in the process. So next up, we're going to flip the ribs over on top of the butter. So when that butter melts and it heats up, it's going to kind of steam into the ribs while they're wrapped. So then we're just going to repeat the same process, but for the other side. So we'll add our butter and then our sugar. One thing I forgot to mention, if you're using foil, make sure that the shiny side is up, because you get your best results that way. Okay, so we're pretty much good to wrap these up now. I'm just going to do one final step, and that's just to add some liquid to this. So I'm using a little bit of beer, and I'm using some of our spritz mix from earlier. So if you remember, that was some apple cider vinegar and some apple juice, but just straight up apple juice is fine. And the idea with this is not to drown it, just to add a little bit of moisture in here, so that when we kind of fold this up, there's enough moisture in there, but not a bath. Like, we're not trying to boil these ribs in here. That's not part of the process. It's just to give it a kind of a little bit of steam, a little bit of moisture. And ideally, you want to measure your foil out beforehand, so it's over twice the length of your ribs, so you can wrap it up without getting gaps. I always double wrap my ribs anyway, but ideally you don't want to have a gap in the first layer. So don't do what I just did, measure it out beforehand and don't wing it. Now with my second layer and my first, I don't tend to wrap them massively tight, but I just try to minimize the amount of air and kind of moisture that's going to leak out of there. So just try and avoid gaps and holes, etc. So with these all wrapped up nice and snug, we're now ready to put them back on the smoker for a couple of hours. Now, a few of the more observant of you may have noticed there's some other food on the barbecue. I'm also cooking some baby back ribs, so hit me up in the comments if you'd like to see a video on those as well. So our ribs are wrapped and they're back in the smoker for a couple of hours. They're going to tenderise now, and the meat's going to start pulling back from the bone. Our next step's going to be to put them back in the smoker unwrapped. Now, our ribs have been sitting in butter, sugar, and all that other good stuff for the last couple of hours. So they're going to be a little bit wet, but this next step will help them to kind of crisp up, caramelise again before we start to add some sauce. Now, unfortunately, I was losing the light big time by this point, so I didn't get a great shot of how these ribs look. So I do apologise about that. Just poor planning on my behalf. So after about half hour, the bark's nice and firm, so we're going to give these ribs a little bit of sauce. I like to use quite a thin sauce for this, so a normal standard barbecue sauce, but with a drop of apple cider vinegar just to thin it out. Then we close the cooker up, give them another half hour or so for the sauce to set, and then we'll take them out for our final stage, which is to rest. And I usually give these about half an hour to rest, but you can adjust that time in the app. And I also loosely cover them with tin foil. Okay, so our final step is the best step. That's to serve these. So we're going to slice these puppies up now and see how they turned out. These came out so well that the camera didn't want to focus in properly. But seriously, they came out really good. The ribs definitely weren't as meaty as I'd like, and to be honest, the rub was a little bit too heavy on the salt, but that may have been counteracted if there's a little bit more meat. But I was happy with the cook. The ribs are really tender. The cherrywood gave the ribs a great smoke taste. And I got a nice clean bite through on the ribs as well. So I know the 3-2-1 method's become a little bit controversial these days, so I'd be really interested to hear from you all on how you cook your ribs, whether or not you use 3-2-1 method or you just bung them straight in the smoke for 6 hours, 5 hours, etc. and done till tender. And maybe I'll film a shootout of those to see which one kind of comes out best. And if you made it this far into the video, Thank you so much for watching. If you like and subscribe, it would help me to know if these types of videos are useful and help me make more in the future. See you in the next one.